That was a wonderful introduction. Yes, my presentation is on women telegraph operators and the railroad, about the profession of the railroad telegraph operators, who basically were the air traffic controllers of the railroad network in the 19th, early 20th century. And we've largely forgotten the importance of the telegraph in maintaining the railroad networks during that time, and even more so the fact that a good many of the people who did that work, who were local station agents, operators, were women. Largely forgotten fact. So my career was in telecommunications and computer science, and I started digging into the history of the telecommunications networks. You know, today we have the internet, we have television, radio, we have the telephone. All of this goes back to our very first digital network, the telegraph network, which existed in the 19th century after Samuel Morse developed his first telegraph system in the 1840s. So all these modern telecommunications capabilities go back to the telegraph. That was the original network. So that's kind of how I got involved in this history. Few dates here to start with. Morse developed his first telegraph line between Washington and Baltimore in 1844. We have the famous message, "What hath God wrought," that was sent from one station to the other. And one of the earliest companies to be formed after that, the Atlantic and Ohio, ran from Philadelphia to Harrisburg as early as 1845. When they started building the telegraph network out, they realized that they needed operators in many of these small towns where they did not have a lot of people with engineering background or electrical background. Women were hired quite often in small towns from the very beginning to work as telegraph operators. It was probably one of the better one of the better jobs a woman could get at that time in terms of the pay. You had to be literate, and you had to have good handwriting, and you had to have some technical skills, which was unusual at the time. One of the earliest women to get involved that we know of was Sarah Bagley, who worked for the telegraph office in Lowell, Massachusetts as early as 1846. And already at that time, she was complaining that she was not being paid as much as the man that she replaced. So that's an old story too. We'll talk a little bit about that. The big name that comes up in telegraphy every time you talk about Western Union, that's the company that most people are familiar with. Western Union was actually organized out of several small companies in 1856. And its focus, given the name of it, the Western Union, its focus was on the Western United States, which at that time was largely the U.S. west of the Mississippi. One of the major accomplishments of the Western Union Company was completion of the first transcontinental telegraph in October 1861, which linked California to the East Coast. At about the same time, the telegraph and the railroad both were developed in much the same time, in the mid-19th century. The railroads, of course, date as early as the 1820s, 1830s, when the very first railroad systems were proposed. And it clearly became obvious that you needed some sort of system to coordinate the movement of trains. And some of the earlier ways they had to coordinate train movements was to simply send a man with a flag down the track in front of the train and say, "There's a train coming, get out of the way." So this was not efficient for a number of reasons. And particularly when you had single track systems and the possibility the trains might be running in both directions, you wanted to make sure that those trains didn't meet in the middle in a very catastrophic way. You wanted to schedule routes so that a train going one way could be pulled off onto a siding if necessary for a train to pass the other way. And so the first time that we know of that it was actually used, the telegraph was used as a signaling system for the railroad, was Charles Minot, who used it on the Erie Railroad in 1851. And the engineer of the train that he did his first experiment on refused to operate the train if the telegraph was going to be doing the routing. He was afraid that it would not work, but it became clear that the telegraph was the right way to signal from one station to the next. There's a train coming at a certain time. And it did actually take quite a while. It was the 1870s before it was universally accepted as the right system for maintaining train movements. And the railroads began to make arrangements with the telegraph company, primarily Western Union, where Western Union would supply the depot equipment and the railroad paid the operator. And when the operator was not handling train movements, he or she would be able to handle personal messages on a commission basis for Western Union. So it was a win-win for the railroads and the telegraph companies both. And this, of course, created a demand for railroad operators in each station. The earliest telegraph receivers, actually one reason why it took a while for the railroads to adopt the telegraph as a signaling system is the very earliest telegraph receivers were printing telegraphs. That is, it would print out the dots and dashes on a paper strip. And the operator would then have to take the strip and sit down with their Morse code book and say, oh, this means this and this and this. Well, that doesn't work very well in a railroad where you've got, number 80 hurtling down the track. So they very early learned that you can actually follow the Morse code by listening to it. And it got to the point where they understood it as a language, that you could listen to the clicking of the sounder, decode the message in your head, and then write it down as you did so. So it became much more efficient, much more of a real-time system, to use modern computer terminology. And that made it much more adaptive to the railroad practice. And what did a railroad telegrapher do? Here's some of the things that a railroad operator would be in charge of. Train routing. The telegraphers were stationed in individual depots. They would receive orders from a centrally located dispatcher and report back on train movements. The dispatcher would say, this train is expected at this time, that train is expected at that time, this one's delayed, and so forth. And the operator would then report back. It's called OSing the trains as they went by. Yes, number 3 did go by at the right time, number 7 is delayed, and this other one is on a siding. So it was a two-way communication from the dispatcher to the individual operator and from the operator back to the dispatcher. Sometimes you needed to hand an order to a train on the run. And you didn't have time perhaps to stop the train at a station. So you would write out the train order. It might say that there's a train on the track ahead, you may need to slow down, you may need to pull into a siding or something like that. And it would be written out on a piece of paper, very thin paper, they called it a flimsy. And it would be stuck on an order staff and handed up to the train as it went by. If you notice the very first slide I showed, it was a woman was handing an order up, and there's some nice order staffs on the wall over here. These triangular things. I periodically get people who email me and find one of those and say, what is that? What is it for? But also they would have to set signals. When you have the block system and you had mechanical signals that would be sent, if you had to route a train off on a siding or change the routing of the train, the operator at the depot would have to take care of that, setting the signals as well, setting the signal levers. And as I mentioned before, because Western Union was supplying the equipment, they could then, when they're not doing railroad business, when they're not directing trains and OSing trains, they could send personal messages for the local community. People would come over to the depot if they wanted to send a telegram to someone, travel plans, or some other personal message, that you could go to the depot operator and he would send that message for you. So that was another aspect. Now here's a picture of a woman handing this illustration was on the cover of the October 1935 Railroad magazine. But what I've got here is some text from a woman who was an operator on the Southern Pacific in 1944, talking about her first experience having to hand order up to a passing train. And she said, then I prepared to go out and hand up. The train was nowhere near the station when I went out and placed myself entirely too close to the track. Lantern at my feet and hoop in the air. The big 5000 coming toward me with its headlight shining loomed larger and larger. I held the train order hoop tightly, and only the fact that I stood too close and the brakeman missed the hoop kept me from being pulled into the train. So it could be dangerous. And typically, after the brakeman would get the hoop, he'd take the message off and throw the hoop down by the trackside, and the operator would have to come out and retrieve it. And you can see these had some pretty rough use, and they would wear pretty badly with use and get broken easily. One of the first railroad operators I was able to find out anything about was a woman named Elizabeth Cogley, who became an operator for the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1855. She had been an operator earlier for this other company, the Atlantic and Ohio. Well, like many early telegraph companies, they would run along for a while on capital. Eventually they would go out of business and close up because they couldn't compete. But in the case of the Atlantic and Ohio station in Lewistown, it was taken over by the Pennsylvania Railroad. This is about the time they were beginning to use telegraph signaling. So they just put her on the payroll as a railroad operator. And she moved to Harrisburg during the Civil War and then sent some very important telegrams about troop movements and mobilization of troops during the Civil War. And she retired in 1900 after 44 years service with the Pennsylvania Railroad. I know this for a fact because when I was up in Pennsylvania, I was scholar in residence at the Railroad Museum in Strasburg at one time. I went over to Harrisburg and went through their retirement records. I found her retirement record. And of retiring in 1900. I've been told many times by scholars who say, you won't find anything on these people because working women did keep journals. But as it turns out, there's a lot out there. Not only did they keep journals, they wrote to the railroad and telegraph magazines, and their families remember them. So it's out there. You can find it. These are some things, early things that were written about women working as telegraph operators back in the 19th century. Virginia Penny wrote a book in 1870 about occupations that were available to women. And she said that if you had good handwriting and you could make as much as $300 to $500 a year. that was good money.
Yeah.
And somewhat later, Martha Rain wrote a book in 1893 who's more concerned with the social standing of the operator. It was considered to be a proper thing to do. You weren't disrespectable if you weren't disreputable if you were. It does not soil their dresses. It does not keep them in standing posture. It does not, they say, compromise them socially. Yeah, basically, in terms of their social standing in the 19th century, they were about, in their communities, were considered to be about on the level of teachers at that time. And many of them were railroad operators. This is a great picture I found of Carrie Pearl Side, who was an operator in Sunbury, Pennsylvania in 1907. And her picture appeared in Railroad Telegrapher magazine. Railroad Telegrapher loved to put photos in there of stations and of operators, and particularly if they were displaying their union sign there, that ORT sign. They were a solid union member. But these are some quotes from railroad magazines about this that happened at the 19th century. At railroad stations where the business has increased enough to warrant the employment of an assistant, a young woman to do the telegraphing is frequently the first helper employed. Frances Willard, who was a reformer associated, I believe, with the Women's Temperance Union at the time, said that they had become so common that one has ceased to even have a feeling of surprise at seeing them. They're just commonplace. And you do find, if you look at 19th century literature, they very rarely even mention the sex of the operator. It could be a man, it could be a woman. It was just not considered unusual at the time. And this is a quote from one woman who ran a signal tower for the Pennsylvania Railroad. She said, most of the operators on the Pennsylvania Road are girls. about the hardest work we have to do is to pull the lever back and forward, which changes the lights. And those early Armstrong levers took a fair amount of muscle to move. So it was, you had to be in good shape to do that. It's difficult to estimate exactly how many women did this because back in the 19th century, you didn't have good census reporting. The railroads didn't keep track of their employees very carefully, nor did Western Union. But if you look at the literature from the time, probably 20 to 25% during the late 19th century, a significant minority of operators were women. They were highly mobile too. I mean, because you had a technical skill, if you knew the Morse code and knew the equipment maintenance, you could pretty much walk into any depot and find employment. And if you weren't happy with the working conditions where you were, or pay, you'd go down the road and get a better job somewhere else. So you had women who actually became boomers and moved from town to town seeking higher pay and better positions. And this woman is a classic example of exactly that. She worked all over the western United States and Mexico and Canada during her career. And well, there she is. Ma Kiley, Mattie C. Kuhn, was born in Texas and worked as a boomer in Mexico, Canada, and across the American West from 1902 to 1916. And raised her son as a single mother after divorcing her first husband. There were several other husbands later on, but that's a lengthy story, it's all in the book. And she finally ended up with the Southern Pacific in Nevada and worked there from 1916 to 1942 when she finally retired. But what's important about her is that she wrote her autobiography, and which was serialized in Railroad Magazine in 1950. And I literally stumbled across this story. I was in a bookstore in Durham, North Carolina, and kicked something with my foot. It was a stack of old railroad magazines. Picked one up and looked at it, and it was one of the episodes that she had serialized. So I got the rest of the issues, put the whole story together, managed to get in touch with her granddaughter out in Nevada, and some other relatives in Texas. And I got the full life story, and got her railroad retirement board file, and this book includes her autobiographical account, The Bug and I is what she called it, as well as some background information on what she was doing at that time. She called it The Bug and I because that's what she used as part of her telegraphy work. If you were a first-class operator and could send and receive very quickly, you probably would get one of these instead of the old Morse key, the Vibroplex, which they call the Bug. Reason being, if you're using the old Morse key, you're going continually up and down, and once you get into a certain speed, 10, 15, 20 words per second, you're going to start to strain those ligaments, and you're going to get carpal tunnel. Or telegraphers used to call that glass arm. You get to the point where you simply could not operate anymore. So they discovered that if you're just going side to side instead, it's much easier on the wrist. And so if you were a top-notch operator, you owned one of those, and that's what you used. And the other feature, it was literally automatic on the dot side. As long as you held it, it had a spring, a reed on there, and as long as you held that side, it would send a series of dots. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, as long as you held it there. So a whole series of dots would only require one motion of the wrist. So much more efficient for sending. I want to talk a little bit about how the telegraph got to North Carolina, why we have it here. North Carolina actually was one of the earlier states to have telegraph. As I said before, Morse's first message was sent in 1844, and already by 1848, the line ran from Virginia down through North Carolina to Charleston, South Carolina. And from Petersburg, actually, in Virginia, down to down to South Carolina. And this is an ad that was in the Raleigh newspaper at the time. about getting some of the people who were financing the telegraph line to pay up, basically, that it was going to be going through Raleigh on that specific date. The magnetic telegraph, what is it? The incomprehensible triumph of science in the arena of profound philosophy. That's marketing PR talk if ever I have seen it. And this is Morse's original telegraph line, which ran all the way from Washington, D.C., down through the southern states, down to New Orleans. This was of strategic importance at the time because this was the age of the Mexican War. And earlier you could get news, and New Orleans was the best port to get news from on the course of the war at that time. Your newspapers could scoop the other papers, and politicians in D.C. would know what was going on and so forth. So this was a very important line when it was established and completed in already 1848. And it's partly funded, but the North Carolina legislature gave them right of way over all the existing railroads and postal routes in the state. And the original line from Virginia down followed the line of the Raleigh and Gaston Railroad down toward Raleigh. And then the first message, it says here, was actually passed down that line through North Carolina on February 14th, 1848. This, one of the earliest railroads to adopt telegraph actually as a signaling system was the North Carolina Railroad, which was chartered in 1849. And by 1856, they had completed trackage from Goldsboro to Charlotte. But the president at that time of North Carolina Railroad, Charles Fisher, was one of the earlier railroad executives to understand the importance of having the telegraph as a signaling system. And he said in 1859 that no road of the length of this one should ever be without one. So he had them working on the telegraph line to go along the tracks at about that time. However, as we know, there were some unfortunate events shortly thereafter. The Civil War, they continued working on the railroad, and they built the telegraph lines from Goldsboro to Raleigh along the tracks, and had that much done by 1861. And in 1862, they continued working on lines from Raleigh to Charlotte. The railroad provided the poles, and a company called the Southern Express Company actually strung the wire and provided apparatus. One of the problems with building it was the fact that as a result of the Civil War, the telegraph company split in half. There was a southern part and a northern telegraph company, and their lines would not connect. So they were chronically short in the south of materials too to build that. So, but after the war, the line eventually halted. In fact, you can see on here, there's a line, you see the beginning of the Western North Carolina Railroad line heading off in the direction of Morganton. In the 1860s, they halted work on that at that time. There was no money available to do anymore, and it would not be resumed. Work on the Western North Carolina Railroad would not be resumed until the 1870s, when you have that whole story of them building the line west from Morganton through the Swannanoa Tunnel, Old Fort, and up to Asheville. And about the same time, you have the beginning of the Asheville to Spartanburg line. Well, actually, I think Spartanburg to Asheville is the direction in which you're with the saluted grade. So you folks know more about that than I do, so I'll leave it at that. But so post-Civil War, you were building out along the railroad lines in North Carolina. I want to talk, this is one operator who shows up in the papers in the 1880s, a woman by the name of Alice Johnston. And she arrived in Wadesboro, North Carolina to work for Western Union in 1882. And evidently caught the attention of the local newspaper editor who wrote up quite a bit about her. And everybody felt that she was making quite an impression with some of the local cotton dealers. They were hanging around the office, get to know her. But her story is kind of interesting. She was born in Urbana, Maryland, and she had learned telegraphy from her cousin, a woman named Annie North. She had been the operator in Urbana, Maryland during the Civil War. And the family story is, I got in touch with family members on this, that the Confederate cavalry showed up in Urbana, Maryland, and strongly suggested she go with them down south. They made her an offer she couldn't refuse. She went with them down to Camden, South Carolina, and decided never to stay there after the war, evidently, and stayed in touch with her relatives back in Maryland. And her cousin suggested that Alice come down, and she became the operator in Aiken at that time for Western Union. And then left Aiken and moved up to Wadesboro to work. Well, a couple things happened in 1883. One is that the telegraphers in the United States went on strike, many of those that were union members. And this created a shortage of, a lot of operators walked off the job. In some cases, Western Union shut down stations because they didn't want union operators working there. The other thing that happened was the boarding house where she was staying in Wadesboro burned down. And this, here again, this is what appeared in the Wadesboro paper about that. So she no longer had a place to live in Wadesboro. And as it turned out, a union operator in another town, where was it that happened? I think it was in Concord. Yes, it was in Concord. The operator in Concord was a woman named Mary Ormond, who was a union member, and she walked off the job. Well, that left an opening, so Alice Johnston went to Concord and took over that job. She was not a union member. But, and as far as I know, the fire at the boarding house had nothing to do with the strike, but it's hard to say at this point. But anyway, the Raleigh News and Observer, which seemed to be sympathetic with the union people, said that 2 weeks ago, the Western Union Company cut its own wires and removed the instruments from the office in Concord, thus depriving the citizens of the benefits of the wires, and all because Miss Mary Ormond, the operator, was a member of the Brotherhood and had joined the strike. But there again, and eventually, the rest of the story is Mary Ormond eventually came back to work at Concord for a competing telegraph company, so there were two women working there at the time. But anyway, Alice Johnston later worked in Henderson, and I believe that's where she met her husband, Robert Louis Green. And after she, like many women, after she married, she left the occupation and moved to Shelby, North Carolina, and had 4 children and died there in 1929. I was able to get in touch with her granddaughter and great-grandson, and they gave me a lot of family information, because they'd known about all this for years and thought no one was interested. But just here's a few other names of people who, women, articles that I found in the Railroad Telegrapher Journal about operators in North Carolina. There was an operator in Flat Rock named Sister Horton in 1898. If you were a union member, you would be referred to in the journals as brother or sister. If you were not a union member, you just got a Mr. or a Miss. A woman named S.D. Taylor, whose picture I've got here, worked in Wilson for a while, and she also ended up working in Sims. There was some dispute over her position in Wilson, I think, and she ended up in Sims. But she also moved up the ladder with the union, and she became the general secretary and treasurer of that union district. So there was an opportunity for women to get more visibility and to work for the union and work for better pay and better rights. So these are just a few of the women whose stories I've come across in some of these telegraph journals. To go back to the union a little bit, telegraphers began to form labor organizations in the 1860s, and women joined from the earliest days because this was the best way to work for higher wages, job advancement, a chance to get ahead. These earlier unions were basically for telegraph operators in general. They began to realize in the 1880s that the work of the railroad operators was quite a bit different from the commercial operators who worked for Western Union. You know, there might be a Western Union station downtown that people used for commercial messages that businesses and newspapers used for news reporting. And there would be an operator in the depot, it would be a railroad operator. So they began to, they're doing slightly different work. So the railroad operators, the Order of Railway Telegraphers broke off and was established in 1886 for specifically the railroad operators. And the telegraphers would go on strike periodically, but mostly the commercial operators would go on. So railroad operators were a bit more conservative because they knew that if they weren't there in the depot, the trains might have, the operation of the train network, the railroad network would be affected adversely. So they did not strike as much as the commercial operators, but they did occasionally. But when there was a strike, the women got their picture in the paper. So this is one way that we know something about them and have a little bit of information about that. Here's some Order of Railroad Telegraphers memorabilia. They had little lapel pins which showed a sounder on the pin, kind of a cute little. And this is a membership card, an ORT membership card. And Railroad Telegrapher was the Union Journal. And like I say, that had a lot of information on the operators and what they did. And they accepted women from as members from the beginning. Here's a story I'd heard about years ago, and I thought I'd check this out while I was down here. There was a union operator named Elizabeth Fain, who was the operator at the depot in Campobello, South Carolina, just south of the border. And I remember reading about this in a 1907 Railroad Telegrapher Journal, and when I was invited up here to talk, I thought, gosh, I remember about somebody from this area that was an operator. So I thought, when I'm up there, I'm going to take a spin down and find out more about it. It turns out it's kind of a sad story. See, this is, you can see there, that is the Asheville and Spartanburg line railroad, and the station was at Campobello. She died young, died at the age of 20. And it's not clear what of. It might have been tuberculosis or some similar ailment, pneumonia or a cold, but she was such a faithful Union member. And like you said, Sister Fain was a good worker for the cause, having been one of the two in this division who secured a prize in the last contest, in which she won an emblem ring. But the poor girl did not live to receive it. The ring had arrived the same evening she was buried. It was just too late for her to be buried with it, which was her desire. So the Union supplied pallbearers for her funeral. And one thing that's really unique, really interesting, is there's a Union emblem on her tombstone. I don't know if you can read it, but that's ORT right there. That's Order of Railroad Telegraphers. And since we got into town early, I thought I'm going to go down to Campobello and see if I can find that church. I knew that she was buried in the graveyard of a Methodist church in Campobello. That was all I knew. So I went down to Campobello. Marcia and I went down there, went into the post office and said, is there a Methodist church with a graveyard around here? And the guy there said, oh, sure, right across the street, go up the street. It's a block up the street. And I went a block up the street, across from the post office at Campobello. There's the Methodist church, and there's her tombstone. Now, on the other side of the tombstone, there's this verse that was obviously her family, her loved ones had put on it. You know, a precious one from us is gone. A place we loved is stilled. A place is vacant in our home which never can be filled. God in his wisdom has recalled the boon his love had given, and though the body slumbers here, the soul is safe in heaven. Holy little sentiment. And we parked in front of the church. I walked into the graveyard, turned right, and there was her family plot, her parents. But oddly enough, this one is turned to the opposite direction from her parents' tombstone. They died some years later, but for some reason it reversed it. So, but anyway, that was an interesting find, a little bit of local history. Women operators were not shy about asking for better treatment, and they were kind of early feminists, I would have to say, in many of their opinions. And these are some things that were in letters to the editor. There was a women's section in the Railroad Telegrapher Journal, and these are a few of the things they had to say. A woman is a good convenience for man, and it's nice to have her keep the meals warm. when number 2 is late. If I was a man, I would have one, even if she was hard to catch. And there were complaints about male operators providing an unfriendly workplace, harassing them and so forth, that surely the positions which husbands and brothers fill are or should be fit places for their wives and sisters. If not, then the men who work at the office would not be fit companions for women. They should be kept in separate houses. So, in spite of all opposition, women will advance. They will not be kept back. And someday, those who fought against will look with wonder and admiration upon the progressive woman. So they were, pretty straightforward. A lot of things about suffrage at this time. Women at this time in the 1890s still did not have the vote. And someday women may all exercise the right of the ballot. In that case, they should have an intelligent conception of what is required of them. Also, some complaints about the unions not doing enough to support women. The men of the ORT, we do not women in the order, for if put to the test, they would go back on us. So they were complaining about that too. The men were bad-mouthing them in some cases. So, these are pretty, for that time, these are pretty straightforward statements to make. Another thing from this era, as with today's internet, a lot of people on the telegraph line met one another. There were relationships that were formed over the line. Operators in their odd moments would begin to communicate with each other and develop personal relationships. And there were short stories and even novels written about this. Wired Love was the most popular one. It was written by a woman named Ella Cheever Thayer, who herself was a former telegraph operator. In 1879 was a bestseller for over 10 years, and as late as the 1890s you could find her books being sold in the telegraph journals. But this led to something else. A lot, and this is happening on the internet today too, I might point out, people pretending to be a person of the opposite sex for one reason or another. And some operators believed they could tell the gender of the operator at the other end by their sending style. That is dubious. But men would, if they wanted to fool someone, one man would email another male operator and claim to be a young woman and meet me for a date. And the guy would show up, and where's the woman? And tricks like this were played. But here's a few lines out of that novel that I mentioned, Wired Love, where the woman is pretending to be a man. And this would, can you not leave? And the man at the other end is, the operator was named Natty Rogers is the fictional heroine of this novel, and she's communicating with a man who goes by the call of C. And C says, can you not, however, leave the beauty out and give me some sort of an idea about yourself for my imagination to work upon? And Natty says, certainly. If you please, a tall young man. That's what she's claiming to be. And he said, oh no, you cannot deceive me in that way. Under protest, I accept the height, spurn the sex. Why, you do not suppose I am a lady, do you? Query Natty, I am quite positive you are. There's a certain difference in the sending of a lady and gentleman that I have learned to distinguish. And you truly say I am wrong. Well, debatable. When silent movies came out, women telegraph operators became quite a common character in many of these early melodramas. You may remember things like The Perils of Pauline, serials, and things of that nature. D.W. Griffith, some of his earliest movies were about a woman telegraph operator at a remote station, and people are trying to break in and rob the safe, and there's a runaway train coming down the tracks that they need to stop, and so forth. And two of these are The Lobedale Operator from 1911 and The Girl in Her Trust in 1912. And both of them are available online. I've got links there. And there was, in fact, a whole series, The Hazards of Helen, about a woman telegraph operator. Helen Holmes was the star of that. In fact, she did most of her own stunts. And I have a little clip here. Let's see if I can play this. From one of the Hazards of Helen. This is from the leak. This one is called The Leak from the Water Tower. Pass a message to the train, and the only way to get to it is to jump off the water tower. Now,
Happens every day.
now, one of the hazards of Helen is trying to run in a long dress. I mean, that was a real fall. There you go. You can find these all online today. They're out there. Throw out a few numbers. How many people actually worked as telegraph operators? How many women? To give you some comparison, in the 1870s through 1920, you had close to 1 million women working as domestic service. Teachers, you had an increasing number from 85,000 up to 600,000 in 1920. And the number of telegraphers go from low numbers in 1870, just the hundreds, this is nationwide, up to the peak year around 1920 when you had 16,000 women working as telegraph operators in the U.S. More than, say, physicians or lawyers, but less than more traditional occupations like teachers and domestic servants. And this kind of breaks it down by area. And the South started off rather more slowly. Women did not enter the occupation there as early as they did in the Northeast and Midwest, but numbers were significantly high by the time you get into 1920 or so. And of course, after that, you see the number of telegraph operators in general, men and women, begin to decline as the telegraph goes out of, is replaced by the telephone and centralized train control. Just why did the telegraph begin to decline then? It continued to provide messaging services in the late 20th century, but the number of telegraph sent began to decline. The railroads no longer used the telegraph for train dispatching after the development of centralized train control, or at least not as much. Partly replaced by the telephone and the internet. Western Union discontinued telegram service in 2006. You can't, after that, you couldn't send a telegram anymore. But they still do an excellent business in money transfers.
Yeah.
It's their big business. But just to run over some conclusions from all this, why is this of interest? Just have a few slides to talk about what role they played in their telegraphers played in their communities, why the story is forgotten, the lack of corporate records, how to research this sort of information, the relationship of the telegraph to the internet, and the relationship of women telegraphers to women in the computer industry, which is something interesting. But telegraphers were recognized by their communities as wizards of the wire who brought news from afar. You were an important person if you were a telegraph operator in your community. And not only are they bringing the news, they're also helping trains to run safely and on time. They were, as I said, the air traffic controllers of the railroad industry. They found innovative ways to combine work and family. There are cases where some moved the telegraph equipment into their home and others moved their families into the depot. Mock Hiley had her son living in the depot for a while, and I can think of some other cases where they kept, and sometimes they taught the kid Morse code and they could handle messages while mother was off doing something else. But they had to deal with gender bias relating to their technical skills. And the role of the telegraph in 19th century America has been largely forgotten. It was America's first digital network. Partly because the telegraph and railroad industries did not keep good corporate records. And those that they did keep were destroyed back in the 60s and 70s as the telegraph and the railroads both began to decline. And plus, it just is partly the attitude of historians. So historians early on tended to focus on institutions, not people. And it's only with the advent of what they call social history that historians started taking individual people and minorities and so forth seriously and learning their stories. So how do we go about researching this? They were vocal members of their profession. They joined unions and professional organizations and wrote to the trade journals. So if you go to those trade journals, you will still find their stories. They were often mentioned in the newspapers. And as I mentioned, if you contact their families, if you trace them down to sites like Ancestry.com, you can find a lot of family connections. I found any of a number of people who remembered the stories of their ancestors as telegraph operators. So And finally, the telegraph and the internet. There's a renewed interest in telegraph as the Victorian internet. And the internet, like the telegraph, is a digital network. You have some of the same gender issues in the internet that you have in telegraph, gender in cyberspace. And finally, there's a certain similarity between the role of women in the telegraph industry and women in the computer industry. Women are becoming software engineers, programmers working and similar percentages, probably 20–25% of software programmers and software engineers are women. And same issues, many of the same issues having to do with pay and recognition in the workplace. So it's important to recognize the achievements of the women who helped shape the global village of worldwide communications and computing. And that's the end of my presentation.